Hi, my name is Amanda Sears, and I'm the horticulture agent here in Madison County, Kentucky. And today we are talking about disease control in the garden. A lot of times when people come to me with problems in their garden, the first thing they'll ask is, well, what do I need to spray? But disease control really starts way before spraying. Prevention is extremely important when it comes to disease control in the garden, and a lot of factors to consider when dealing with plant diseases. First of all, what plant are we looking at? How does it normally grow? What does it normally look like? When did the problem begin? Has it been going on all season? Did it just crop up yesterday? And then what are the symptoms? Are we seeing spots? Are we seeing dieback? Are we seeing collapse? These are all questions we have to take into consideration before we can figure out what's really going on. In the art of war, we learned the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. And so the way I look at it, prevention is the first key in order to control garden problems. Cultural sanitation, mechanical and physical means, and biological too. But we're going to look at all those today. But first, a little biology. Biotic diseases include fungi, bacteria, viruses, nematodes, and phytoplasmas. There are also, though, non-infectious disorders, and we call those abiotic. And those include temperature extremes, soil moisture problems, which are very common here because of how much clay we have in our soil, nutrient imbalances, such as too much nitrogen or not enough, adverse soil pH, which is also common here because we have such a high pH in our soil sometimes from our limestone, and chemical injuries. But first, is this a disease? This is blossom end rot, which is very common on tomatoes. And basically, it is the blossom end of the tomato fruit dies back. And this is actually not a disease. This is a nutritional issue and calcium deficiency. And we have plenty of calcium in our soil, but it can only be taken up when water is available to the plant. And so what happens is, as we have a lot of rain, and then we have a lot of dryness, and we have a lot of rain and dryness, and during those dry periods, the plant can't take up calcium, and so it ends up showing up as a dead spot on the end of the tomato. And the best thing you can do is to prevent it by having a mulch and proper around the plant and properly irrigating it throughout the season. But to someone who doesn't know, they might worry that they have an infectious disease that they have to deal with. So spraying in this case wouldn't do anything. So we're going to go over a few common abiotic problems, and remember those are ones that are not something that a plant can catch, it's something in the environment. After a rain, we often have leaf curl, which is very alarming to see to a lot of people, and I've noticed on some varieties of tomato that is more common than on others. And I do see that on other plants as well. Most of my examples today will be from a tomato because that is what I had the most photos of. Another common problem is sun scald. And you see this commonly on peppers as well. But what happens there is if the plant defoliates some, then light from the sun hits the fruit and can sometimes sunburn it. And sometimes after that whiteness that we see, it might follow that we would also maybe have some fungal spores that come on as a secondary infection that did not cause the original problem. Cat facing occurs early in the fruit formation as it's starting to have into little fruit, but it's not anything that can affect other plants. A couple more things would be iron chlorosis on blueberry. And when we talked about fruit, I mentioned that blueberry requires a lower pH than most of the other plants that we grow. If the pH is too high, the plant can't take up nutrients that are in the soil. And so odds are this plant is growing in a soil that has a high pH and it can't take up iron. The picture on the right is a phosphorus deficiency on corn. And it's interesting, oftentimes a phosphorus deficiency creates a purple color. So this is just something to think about. This is called the disease triangle, and it's very common when you're learning about plant pathology. Because in order to have a disease outbreak in your garden, you have to have three things happening. You have to have the host that's susceptible to a disease. You have to have the pathogen to affect the host, and you have to have the right environment. And if you take one of those out, the pyramid or the triangle, I guess you could think of it that way, collapses. So you have to have the right environment or the right conditions. You have to have susceptible hosts, and you have to have an abundance of a pathogen. And if you take one of those out, so the one thing that we can often work on is the environment. Pathogens are everywhere, and so what we have to work on is figuring out how to make a garden site that does not appeal to pathogens. So we're going to talk now about the fungi, bacteria, virus, and phytoplasmas, and the nematodes. So first, fungi symptoms. Something to think about is 85% of all plant diseases are fungal. And so in a given year, when people bring in plant samples for me to look at, they're almost always caused by a fungal problem. And fungal infections are spread by spores. The good thing, if you want to look at it as a positive, is a lot of times these fungal infections are host specific. And so, for instance, the same thing that might affect an oak tree would not also affect an elm tree. Or another garden example would be something that would affect a squash plant probably would not affect a tomato. Another good thing is with fungal infections is you can see evidence of it with your naked eye. So the picture at the right is a zoomed in picture of a spot on a leaf. You can see those little raised pimple black places. Those are fungal spores, and so that tells me that we're dealing with a fungal infection. And examples of fungal infections include mildews such as powdery mildew, which looks like baby powder on the leaves, root rots, wilts, blights, rust, and one of the most common symptoms, like what we're looking at there, are leaf spots. So what conditions favor fungal growth? Well, we talked about this when we talked about gardening, but we don't want the plant to stay wet any longer than it has to, because that sets up an environment for pathogens to grow. And so also warm conditions. Most of the time, some fungal infections also prefer cool weather. And so sometimes when people bring in examples for me to look at, we kind of have to think back, what kind of weather did we have a week ago, 2 weeks ago, when they started to see problems pop up. So fungal infections can spread via air currents, splashing rain and water on people as we walk through the garden, soil that might be spread maybe on a rototiller, seeds, and tools. And to talk about air currents for a second, there are several diseases such as downy mildew that actually come up from the Gulf of Mexico on air currents. And so they may not be in the environment at the beginning of the season, but based on conditions between here and there, they kind of creep up. And then here are some examples of fungal infections. On the left is a septoria leaf spot, and you can see there's very tiny spots covering the leaves. On the right is southern blight, and that stem is, I believe, at the crown of the plant. So as the plant is going into the ground, we see this mass of fungal mass growing, and you can see there's small pimples on there, and so that would be the spores in that case. And this is a very common disease, probably the most common one I see on tomato plants. And on that spot to the far left, if you look carefully, you can see that the spot actually has kind of concentric rings or almost like a target on it. And that can be very common with fungal diseases, is this target spots when you look. So to look at bacteria symptoms, if you look at that list, a lot of those are very similar to what you might see if you are thinking you might have a fungus. And so wilts, leaf spots, soft rot, galls, and cankers. And to the right, we see a gall, I believe it's on a blackberry. And what appears there is what we're seeing is that gall is actually material from the plant that's been infected and it grows out of control. Cankers, which is a term we use a lot when we're talking to people about plant pathology, is basically the equivalent of like a sore if we cut our arm. And that's just a general way to look at it. So what conditions favor bacterial growth? Well, they're very similar to what the same conditions that fungal spores like to grow in, and that is a wet an area, warm, and interestingly enough, bacteria have to go into natural openings or wounds on the plant. And I didn't mention that with fungal growth, but fungi are able to actually pierce a plant in order to get inside it to make an infection. With bacteria, they don't have that mechanism, so they actually can only enter in natural openings or wounds. And that's why it's important when you're purchasing transplants or when you're growing your own plants to keep them healthy and not have any damage on them. If you're putting a plant out that already has damage, it's leaving a place for these bacteria to come in. It spreads very easy, same as the list we saw with fungal infections, and it is also seed transmissible. And I didn't really go into a lot of detail on fungal growth earlier with the seeds, but some conditions, the bacteria, virus, and the fungi, some of them can be seed transmissible. And that is why it's so important. If you are saving your own seed from year to year, be sure to only collect seed from plants that are healthy. Some of the diseases are on the outside of the leaf, I'm sorry, on the outside of the seed, and some are on the inside. Bacteria reproduction happens very quickly, and so outbreaks of bacterial problems can grow out of control very quickly. And so that is one reason, and I know I say this again and again, but to scout your garden as often as you can, walk through it, see if how things are going. And if you see a problem, remove it. You're always welcome to bring in a sample by the office or email me with questions or pictures and we can talk about it. So I mentioned with fungal infections, one interesting thing is you can see it with your eye. Almost always we'll see spores there. With bacteria, they're so small that we don't see them. Now, to the picture to the right, we see actually bacterial oozing coming out of the plant. And my scope that I have here isn't strong enough to see that. But if it were, I would be able to zoom in and see maybe a hole or a little bad spot on the plant and see this bacterial oozing coming out. And that would tell me that this is in fact a bacterial infection. So a few examples of bacterial problems. So to the left is a bacterial spot, and at first glance, that looks kind of similar to the septoria that we saw earlier in the fungal pictures. But one difference is that you can see there's a lot of yellowing, especially around the spot, and that's a common symptom when we're talking about bacterial spots. To the right is a bacterial canker. And what we see there is just basically a collapse of the stem. Now, if someone brought that in, the reason I would probably think it would be bacterial would be when I cut it open, I would see that there aren't any fungal spores, very large fungal spores in this case. Usually, if it's in a stem like this, they're going to be big enough that they're going to look like, for lack of a better descriptor, mouse poop in there. It's going to be little black, hard little pieces. And the fungal spores sometimes are big when we're looking at fungal problems, and sometimes they're very small. But this collapse is very common. And what happens is it's just destroying the vascular system of the plant and it's spreading throughout. And this is bacterial soft rot of a potato. And literally, this is the worst smell I've ever smelled in my entire life, is the bacterial soft rot of a potato. And you can see the outside, it looks like the outside of this potato probably is not affected. And so you may have not even really been able to notice what might be going on inside. So with viruses, how does a plant catch a virus? And of course, these are viruses that aren't affecting us. These are only plant specific. Like bacteria, they need wounds or natural openings in order to affect a plant. And the way that they usually infect a plant is by insect vectors, mostly aphids, thrips, whiteflies, and mites. The picture to the right is a very close-up picture of an aphid. One other way that viruses are spread is through pollen transmission. or seeds. And I mentioned earlier that bacteria and some fungal infections can also be spread that way. Virus symptoms are very unique looking, and when you see them, you'll definitely think, that's very strange. And they can look similar to herbicide damage. But some ways that we would describe virus symptoms include mosaic, rosettes, ring spots, and leaf curling. And remember, we talked about leaf curling as being an abiotic problem. And so that is one reason to kind of keep an eye on things if they are looking strange, because sometimes viruses can look similar to an abiotic problem. Abiotic problems can look similar to a fungal problem. So it's just important, if a problem is cropping up, to really keep an eye on things. And you can see to the right, you can see common bean mosaic, and it has a very strange, almost puckering look to the plant and a discoloration. If you have a virus, the best thing to do is scout out and remove the plant. Because it is spread mostly from insects, what can happen is an insect will come in, maybe that isn't infected with the virus, feed on a plant that has it, and now that insect is now carrying that virus from plant to plant, because insects aren't born with the virus in them. They have to get it from a plant they've been feeding on. And I didn't mention, but scouting out and removing a sick plant is probably the best thing to do, whether it's a bacterial problem or a fungal problem, especially if you're doing it early, and that way you're preventing other problems from cropping up. So here's some good examples of virus problems. And like I said, viruses are very strange looking. And so a lot of times if a virus does come in, you can easily tell what it is. So on the left is rose rosette, which is by an infection from a mite that is blown in on the wind. And you can see there's a profusion of red growth there that does not look normal. And you also might see, it's called a witch's broom, which is a proliferation of branches in that area. And you might see an excessive amount of thorns. Once the plant is infected and you start to see the symptoms, it's been systemic, and so the plant will have to be removed. And to the right, we see a watermelon mosaic virus, and some very interesting symptoms there, where it's just different colors, rings, and really, strangely, I don't see a lot of viruses that come into the office, but when they do, they're always very unique and in a way, pretty. So phytoplasma and nematodes, I know I might see a phytoplasma once every couple of years. They cause dwarfing and distortion, and oftentimes a yellow discoloration, very rare. And as far as nematodes, I only know of one person that in my 15 years here have had nematodes in here in the Madison County. And so I don't think it's really anything to worry about, but just something to mention. So how do you prevent these problems? If prevention is so important, how do you get started on the right foot? And so the first thing is certified pathogen-free or heat-treated seed. Because remember, the big three, virus, bacteria, and fungal infections, can sometimes be carried over on seed. You want to clean your pots, flats, stakes, shovels, boots, anything that's going to be in contact with plants with 10% solution. Because remember, with a lot of these, they can be transmitted on soil. And so soil can kind of stick to everything if you're not cleaning it off. As things die in the season, remove the debris. And also at the end, you might want to deep till anything that's remaining. What should you do with that? Well, I don't think I recommend composting it, because the compost piles, most compost piles I know anyway, do not get hot enough in order to kill any pathogens that's there. So what would happen is you might put a sick tomato plant in there. It might break down, but it's not hot enough to kill that problem. So then when you put the compost back on the garden, the problem is there again. You want to remove any weeds and volunteers. And the reason for that is airflow. We want good airflow in the garden because we want the plants to dry out as quickly as possible. And with volunteers, sometimes those are areas where vectors, that become vectors for places where insects can, that can be plants that insects are attracted to. They end up being vectors of viruses and other problems. And I've already talked about scouting after plants. So there are also some varieties of plants there are some varieties within types of plants that can be chosen. So to the right, I have what I found online for sweet million tomato if I wanted to order it from a seed catalog. And if you look down, it does have some resistance to Fusarium, which is a fungal infection, root knot nematode, Septoria, which is a fungal infection, and then a virus. And so if I'd known in the past that I've had fungal problems or nematodes, let's say, sweet million tomato would probably be good to put in the garden because it has resistance to it. Now, this is not the same as being a GMO. This does not have anything to do with a genetically modified organism. These are just varieties of tomato and of any other vegetable, flower, anything that scientists over the years, agriculturalists, have bred tomatoes or any other plant in order to have resistance to different types of diseases. And so don't be nervous about buying plants that have some resistance bred into them. I think a lot of people get confused by that, and just wanted to, so it's something I wanted to mention. Use healthy transplants and seeds. And I did mention earlier, at least with bacteria and viruses, they need an opening to enter the plant. And so if you're already putting in plants that are beat up, you're already setting yourself up for a hard time in the garden. Plant in warm soils, and for cool season crops, things like broccoli and kale, that's not true. Obviously, you would plant those when it's cooler. But for warm season crops like tomatoes and peppers, they really do grow better in warm soils. And it's a beautiful day here. It's about 75. And I know everybody is really wanting to garden. But if you can wait till the soils warm up, it really does help with the health of the plant. Another big issue here in Madison County is soil drainage. We have a lot of clay in our soil. And so you want to pick an area that does have good soil drainage because you don't want the roots of the plant to stay wet too long. And so one way to combat that is if you're having problems, then maybe think about putting in a raised bed. And soil fertility. We do offer free soil testing here at their extension office. We want to know, what is the pH of the soil. Remember, I mentioned blueberries have a certain pH range that they need they need in order for nutrients to be taken up. Sometimes we might get a little too high in that pH. Sometimes we might be a little too low. And how much phosphorus and potassium do we need? Do we need more nitrogen? I didn't mention this earlier as an abiotic problem, but one thing is if you have put too much nitrogen on your plants, for example, a tomato, this happens commonly every year. I get a few calls. People will say, my plant is just growing beautifully. It's a huge plant, beautiful, dark green leaves, but it's not giving me any fruit. And what's happened is the plant has too much nitrogen. And so all that energy is going into production of leaves, and it's actually not producing any fruit. So I think people oftentimes want to over-fertilize, but that creates a whole set of problems as well. Crop rotation is very important, and I think it's a little confusing to people sometimes because it's not just crops that we're rotating. We can't, for instance, if we have a tomato here this year, we can't put peppers in that same spot next year. Because they're in the same plant family. So the circles to the right are groups of plant families and their cousins, so to speak. So for instance, pumpkin and squash and watermelon, cucumber, cantaloupe, those are all cucurbits. Tomato, potato, eggplant, tobacco, and pepper, those are all solanaceous. And so when we're rotating, we're not rotating within a plant family, we're rotating plant families. And ideally, we want to rotate a plant family away from a site for 2 to 3 years. And that can be difficult in a small garden situation. So, if you don't have a lot of room, just try to do the best you can. How far is far enough, in a rotation? Does it need to be 5 feet away? Does it need to be 2 feet away? It's something just that we have to kind of figure out, but at least move it away from that exact hole and that exact spot is the most important thing, I think. A few more things to think about. We already talked about air movement and plants. Don't plant your plants too close. I think we are all probably, let's back up, I am guilty of wanting to plant things too closely together because it makes it look more full. But again, airflow dries the plants out quicker. Trellising gets things off the ground. A lot of these diseases live in the soil. That's why we're rotating. And so if it rains and raindrops hit the plant and it jumps back up onto the plant, then some infection can occur. So you want to water at the soil line for that reason, because again, rainwater hitting the soil jumps back up onto the plant. And so also mulch for the same reason. It's creating a barrier. And also it creates a more even soil moisture. If we think back about that blossom end rot problem, you'd be less likely to have that problem if you had a more even soil moisture. And I already mentioned, but make sure and save seed only from healthy plants. Now, I'm not a big advocate of chemical control if possible. One thing we talked about insects in our last class, with insects, you don't spray until they're a problem. But sprays for disease are a little different. Sprays for diseases are protectants. And so they actually need to be sprayed before the problem starts. So, but again, I'm not a big fan of any chemical that we don't really need to use. So why would we need to use a chemical? Well, if you have had problems over the years again and again, then you know that perhaps you do need to spray. If the weather patterns this spring seem to be wetter than usual or maybe warmer than usual, that might be another reason to spray. So some of these, fixed copper, for instance, is actually, I believe an organic. They have some organic options on some of these. I'll put it more generally. There are organic options for chemical control, but still, organic or not, it's still a chemical. So fixed copper is a general purpose fungicide, bactericide. Then there's sulfur, hydrogen dioxide, and then there are some chemicals that are general purpose fungicide that you can find as well. Chlorothalonil is probably one of the easiest to find at the stores locally. So also chemical control, another thing to think about if you're going to spray, make sure and read the label. For instance, if someone asks me a question about chemicals, I have to tell them exactly what the label says. Otherwise, it is against the law. Make sure and spray on a calm weather day so that you're not getting any drift, and make sure and dress appropriately. For instance, gloves, boots, or at least closed-toed shoes. Be aware of beneficials and pollinators. Even though this is not an insecticide, it's still a chemical that could affect beneficials, pollinators, fish, anything in the area. And so be sure to read the label on that. Look at the harvest interval and the re-entry time. Once sprayed, how long until you can safely enter the garden again? And how long between the time that you spray, then can you harvest? Because as we get later in the season, that can become more important. So check out also the material safety data sheets, which are available online on all the different chemicals. For instance, I mentioned earlier chlorothalonil, and a common name for that is daconil. And so you could put daconil material safety data sheet, Google that, and your sheets will come up. So the plant pathology department at UK has a lot of great publications. And so one is called the Integrated Pest Management Scouting Guide. And these guides are very in-depth with a lot of pictures that not just of diseases, but also insects for a lot of different crops. And so they're really great guides. And so they cover cold crops, legume vegetables, sweet corn, cucurbits, which again are cucumbers, squash, those sorts of things, and solanaceous crops like tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant. And I put at the bottom of the screen a link to the pubs at the Department of Plant Pathology. They also offer sustainable disease management guides for the same crops that I mentioned earlier. These are geared more towards homeowners, and they break down the time of year and the growth stage and what you should be doing in the garden, as well as the diseases and chemical management. And you can see on the far right, you can actually see that the products that have an asterisk by them are actually, I believe, organic. So for the backyard fruit, I've talked mostly about vegetables, but they do also have a lot of backyard fruit disease and pest management. For apple and pear, great peach and stone fruit, and berry. And you can see the example below is for strawberries. And on these guides, it breaks it down into growth stage of the different plants. So pre-bloom and during bloom, for instance. And it also then, on the right-hand side, breaks it down into diseases, what needs to be done, insects, and what needs to be done. So one nice resource is the Organic Gardener's Handbook of Natural Insects and Disease Control. And this is a really great guide that I keep on my desk and use very often. Another great guide that's indispensable is the Home Vegetable Gardening Guide in Kentucky. And I put the link there because they do have a lot of updates in it this year, and it's a really great publication. If you aren't able to get a copy, or you don't want to print a copy, make sure and just call our office and we'll send you one, or come by and we can give you a copy. So again, my name's Amanda Sears, and I'm the horticulture agent here in Madison County, Kentucky. If you want to get a hold of me, my email address is amanda.sears@uky.edu, and my phone number is 859-623-4072. Again, thanks. And if you ever have any questions, be sure to get in contact with me. Have a great day.